Hello, welcome to day 2 of our Lister Celebration Week. So today we have a real treat, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr Lindsey Fitzharris, author of The Butchering Art, a biography of Joseph Lister himself. Dr Fitzharris obtained a PhD in the history of science, medicine and technology at Oxford University in 2009. She gained a postdoctoral award from the Wellcome Trust in 2010, and she's also the writer and host of a TV series on the Smithsonian Channel called The Curious Life and Death of. This TV series explores mysterious deaths in history. She's written articles for the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Lancet, and The New Scientist. The Butchering Art, published in 2017, won many awards, including the Wilson Literary Science Writing Award, and it was shortlisted for the Wellcome Book Prize and the Wilson History Prize. It was named a notable non-fiction book in 2018 by the American Library Association. It has been a huge success and has been translated into 14 languages. I read The Butchering Art when it first was published, and I can recommend it to anyone who's interested in Victorian surgery and, of course, Joseph Lister. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk with Lindsey.
Thank you so much for that thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here celebrating Joseph Lister.
I know, we're so thrilled to have you talking this week with us, Lindsey. But I realise I've actually been in a meeting with you before when you came to Glasgow in 2018 with the Royal College Listermania.
That's right. Listermania in 2018, it was great because I had just come off this worldwide tour with The Butchering Art. And mostly I've been talking to audiences who didn't know who Joseph Lister was, except maybe through Listerine, which he didn't even create. It was named for him, but not by him. And it wasn't even used in the 19th century as a mouthwash. It was used more commonly to treat gonorrhea, something I'm pretty sure that the Listerine company isn't too pleased I'm going around talking about. But yeah, I was going on this tour and telling people who had never really heard about Lister. So going to Listermania was wonderful to talk to people who knew who he was, who wanted to celebrate his legacy, much like Lister Week now.
Yeah. And have you been back in Glasgow since, or was that the only time you've been to visit?
Well, I've been to Glasgow before Listermania. I haven't been since Listermania. I'm hoping to get back with my second book. I could just about understand that Glaswegian accent. And it's such a wonderful city. So hopefully when things are safer, I can get back up there.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah. So I guess the big question that we all have is, what was it about Joseph Lister that made you choose him as the subject of your book?
Well, it's a bit of a sad story. So I was going through a really traumatic divorce and I was facing deportation from the UK. I had lived here for 10 years, but I was on a marriage visa. So the Home Office contacted me and they said, they took my passport and they said that I wasn't allowed to work while they reviewed my case. I knew I'd always wanted to write a book. I didn't know what about. Now, of course, medical historians and scholars and doctors, they know who Joseph Lister is, but I was surprised to find out that there hadn't been a popular history about him. And his story is really fundamental to understanding the way we are today. I mean, this great paradigm shift that occurs because of Lister's work. So I gravitated towards that. And, there's a lot of cinematic moments in Lister's story as well. In fact, The Butchering Art opens with the first ever operation under ether in 1846 in Britain. And that was performed by Robert Liston. And it was an incredible moment in the history of medicine. And a 17-year-old Joseph Lister was in the audience. And I always joke that if I was writing the movie script, I couldn't write it better than that. So his story, has those kind of cinematic moments. And it's been a real privilege to tell it. And I always tell people that, Lister saved thousands of lives in his own time. He continues to save people's lives today because we operate with the knowledge that germs exist. And he really saved my life because this book has just lifted me out of a terrible situation. And it's been a real privilege to tell his story.
Oh gosh, that's an amazing story, and I think that was really lovely for you to share all that with us, and a real kind of delve into what was the inspiration there, and you called it a love story between science and medicine. What was the kind of theme behind that description of it, Lindsey?
Yeah, I do. I like to call it a love story between science and medicine because, if you're coming to The Butchering Art without a PhD in history or you have no medical background, hopefully you can enjoy this book. You don't need any prior knowledge. And I like to describe it that way because it's one of the first times that a scientific principle is applied to medical practice. So what was happening, I mean, I don't need to tell you, of course, the story, but for anybody who's just kind of coming into this and doesn't quite understand, Louis Pasteur was working on germ theory. He'd come up with this idea of germ theory in France. And what was happening was he was trying to understand why wine vats were spoiling. This is very important to the French, you see. And he had discovered that bacteria or germs were getting into these wine vats and they were causing it to sour. Now, Lister, for various reasons, he's very scientifically minded. He reads about Pasteur's theory and he wonders if the thing that's getting into the wine vats is also getting into his patients and causing these wounds to sour. And actually, surgeons would say if a wound got infected, they'd say it soured or it healed sweetly if it wasn't infected. And that's how he starts to piece this mystery together. And so it's really this kind of coming together of science and medicine. And much, much later in life, Lister actually travels to Paris and he presents an award to Pasteur. And he says about Pasteur what I really think Pasteur could have said about Lister, that they had both changed the world. So I do see this as a love story between science and medicine.
Great. And going back even earlier in Lister's life, so he was a medical student in London, and quite a lot of our medical students, I'm hoping, will be signed up for this webinar. So what would life have been like as a medical student for Joseph Lister?
Very different to what it was like today. Although I have to say that, we are living through strange times, as everybody knows. And, the pandemic right now is exposing the medical community into a lot of dangers that we aren't used to. We haven't been used to that kind of danger, in the recent past. But when Lister entered medical school in the 1840s, of course, this is before mass vaccinations. It's before antibiotics. They're not wearing gloves in the dissection room. So it was really quite dangerous. And a lot of medical students died as a result of going into this profession. In fact, Charles Darwin's uncle by the same name, his name was also Charles Darwin, was dissecting a child in Edinburgh, and he cut his hand and he got this terrible septic infection and he died. He died at the age of 17. So going into medicine was a very serious decision. It's still a serious decision today, but I think that the implications were even bigger because, of course, you could die as a result of going into that profession.
So he managed to survive that ordeal, obviously, and then coming up to Scotland, what were the driving forces for Lister to come up to Edinburgh initially?
Yeah, it's perfect that Lister ends up in Scotland, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the interview. But what happens is he has a mental breakdown. He contracts a mild case of smallpox. Now, what preceded that was that his own brother had contracted smallpox and then later died. But what we think today now is that he died of a brain tumor. But Lister could have possibly been thinking, the smallpox was, adding to the neurological issues that his brother was suffering from. So that happens. Then Lister contracts smallpox. And I think he went through this sort of crisis where he wondered what was the point of medicine, that doctors couldn't save his brother, that he had also gotten sick, and maybe he shouldn't be in this profession at all. So he has this mental breakdown and he leaves medical school. And someone recommends that he go up to Edinburgh and to meet this guy named James Syme, who was a very famous surgeon at this time. In fact, I believe that there is still a procedure that we do that bears Syme's name, which is a removal of a diseased foot at the ankle joint. But Syme was a great surgeon. And so Lister goes and he meets him. And it's Syme who reinvigorates this love of surgery in him. And in turn, Lister falls in love with Syme's daughter, Agnes, who we could talk about a little bit later. But he sort of settles in Edinburgh for some time. And then later a position opens up in Glasgow. And so he finds himself there. And that's where the bulk of his early research in antisepsis and germ theory happens.
So it must have been quite difficult for him to leave Edinburgh, where he was working with his father-in-law, because they obviously had a very good relationship. So what sort of made him make this separation from Syme at that stage?
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. And I think that, Lister had such admiration for Syme. And you see this a lot in the butchering art as well, this relationship that forms. But an opportunity had come up. And I think Syme, as well as Lister, knew that, sometimes you got to leave the nest. And Syme was such a reputable surgeon there. He really ruled that little kingdom. And so Lister wasn't going to necessarily thrive in the way that he did when he went to Glasgow, where he can make his own kingdom, so to speak. So I think the opportunity arose, it wasn't so far that it was problematic for Agnes. She could still visit her family. And thank goodness he did, because that was really where all of his breakthroughs were made, was in Glasgow.
Yeah, so when he first arrived, I think there's a description of what Glasgow was like at that time, Lindsey, and it doesn't sound very appealing.
No, it was, I don't think any place really in sort of 1850s was very pleasant to our modern sensibilities, certainly. There was a lot of overcrowding, there was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of sickness. Of course, diseases that we just simply don't see today. People really take it for granted. Like a lot of the things that we've eradicated through vaccines or we can treat through antibiotics, that was all prevalent in these communities. And in fact, a lot of the cases that you even see in the butchering art, they're really extreme cases. Like there's this man who has a face tumor and it's been growing for the last 8 years. And it's huge by the time he gets into Syme's hand, who does the operation. And people say, well, why would he have waited so long? But I mean, first of all, you know this because you're a doctor. Patients still wait. They wait, they put it off, they have excuses for not seeking medical attention. But of course, in that time, going into these hospitals certainly didn't mean that you were going to survive the experience. So I think a lot of patients, they waited too long. They thought that it would go away, or maybe just it wouldn't worsen. And so you get really extreme cases in this period. But yeah, it was very different, obviously, to what Glasgow looks like today. And the experience would have been very different for the patient.
Yeah, thank goodness.
So, yeah, thank goodness, exactly.
So obviously he got his professor of surgery at the university, and it was quite a few years before he was allowed to actually have patients in the Royal. And I think his medical students just thought the world of Joseph Lister.
Yeah, he was a wonderful teacher. And as you say, he wasn't allowed patients for a while. There was a lot of politics going on. There's still a lot of politics going on in medicine. What I love is going through the Lancet in this period, because people get into real fights. There were even duels between surgeons. They would have these huge falling outs. And it was one of those times when everybody's passions were high and everybody let each other know about that. But he was beloved by his students, as you say, and his students are really the key to his triumph, because, when Lister came out with his theories, there was a lot of pushback. It's really hard for us to understand that today. It makes sense for us to wash our hands, for instance, but before you understood germ theory, why would you wash your hands between patients if they're just going to get dirty again? So you don't have that kind of same paradigm that you're operating in. But he's able to convince the younger generation. And as you say, he was an incredible teacher. And they become known as the Listerians. And they go out and they spread the gospel of Lister. And we get this Listerian Revolution. So he was an incredible man in all respects. And I think he was a very kind man, and he was very kind towards his students.
And did they not petition to actually get him into the hospital to have patients? Because they were desperate to be taught by him on the wards.
Yeah, that's right. Where would Lister have been without the people around him? When right before he died, he had actually requested that his personal correspondence be destroyed, because he wanted his story to be told through his scientific and medical achievements alone. So I always joke that if Lister was alive, he probably would hate my book, because there's a lot about his personal life in it. And thankfully for me as a historian, that correspondence wasn't destroyed. So we have all of these wonderful letters between him and his father, who was a huge influence, between him and Syme. And what I like about that message is that people have to understand that scientific progress and medical progress isn't created in a vacuum. We are all the product of influences around us. And he certainly was driven by the people around him, whether it be James Syme convincing him to go back into surgery, whether it be his father who had given him the microscope when he was a little boy, or whether it was his students who had pushed for him to receive patients and to be teaching on the wards. These are all influential to making Joseph Lister who he ultimately became.
And they're lovely positive stories as well. It's all about him being a kind, sympathetic, lovely person that's given him success that we're celebrating now. So let's get into
it's funny because I'm writing this other book, which we could talk about at the end. But Lister, he's almost too good to be believed on some level, and I'm sure there's a bit of hagiographical aspects of kind of making him into a saint. And people really clearly did love him in his own time. But yeah, the stories are almost unbelievable. He didn't charge his patients. He let them determine how much they could afford, which really sort of ticked off his colleagues, so that made everybody else look bad. And there's a really lovely story of him sewing the leg back onto a patient's doll. And so he was very compassionate. And I think that, at a time when surgery was so brutal, that was an unusual trait for someone.
So Lindsey, we're all really loving the whole gory bits of the butchering art, and I think unfortunately that's what people really like these days. So let's go into the surgery where Lister was performing some of his early procedures. Just tell us, what were they like?
It's funny you say that too, because there was someone who read my book and left a review on Amazon, and they said that the book got more boring as it went on. As Lister begins to triumph, everything gets clean, and people aren't dying quite to the extent. But really, within his lifetime, there was such a huge shift. So in the earlier period before Lister walks on the scene, these operating theaters were filled to the rafters, sometimes with ticketed spectators. People actually bought tickets to see this. And people will say to me, well, the Victorians must have been very morbid, but we do have a lot of medical television on. We have a lot of documentaries. I think our curiosity about what happens in that OR is still very much alive today. But people did come in, and of course they carried with them the grime and dirt of everyday life. These places were not sterile. And the floor of the operating theater could be so crowded at times that it actually had to be cleared before the surgeon could commence the operation. And the surgeon himself, he rarely washed his hands, as we've established. He would wear a bloody apron, and that apron, you would want your surgeon to be wearing a bloody apron because it would signify that he was very experienced. And he carried sort of a cadaverous smell that they called good old hospital stink. So these places didn't just look different. They didn't just feel different, certainly for the patient, but they smelled different. And these hospitals were very dangerous places to enter. And if you were wealthy or you were middle class, you would opt to have your operation in your own home because it was a more controlled environment.
Yeah, pretty awful. And poor Agnes must have hated him coming home from work with all his aprons. But they had a lovely marriage, didn't they? They had a really lovely relationship, Agnes and Joseph.
They did. People have asked me subsequently, they wanted to know more about Agnes, and I wanted to know more about her. But, I'm constrained as a nonfiction writer to what's sort of in the records. But I did get a sense that she really was sort of the organized mind behind this sort of chaotic genius at times. She would record his lecture notes. She would keep them to schedule. She helped redecorate the lecture room that he was teaching in. And she also performed experiments with him. So she also had a real scientific mind. Now, I know you're doing an event soon about Lister's views about women in surgery, which, to our 21st century eyes, that was maybe one of his flaws. But of course, we're talking about the Victorian period, and not a lot of men saw, surgery to be a female space. In fact, if he had advocated women's involvement, that would have been more extraordinary than his stance as it stood. But Agnes was very much an important part of his life. And again, very much what I said about how nothing's created in a vacuum. And she's a lovely part of his story.
And he was touched by tragedy as well with other female members of his family, his mother and his sister. They were sad stories well. So can you tell us more about them?
Yeah, his mother dies of, I think it's erysipelas. And his sister, it's an extraordinary moment, talking about those cinematic moments. I'm actually trying to get this made into a movie because, and I joke that I'm going into Hollywood and I'm telling them that there is this Quaker surgeon and everybody needs to know about him and he deserves this huge Hollywood budget. But it's an extraordinary story. And one of those moments is when he performs a mastectomy on his own sister on his own dining room table. And, I don't know, but I'm guessing that today ethics would keep a close family member out of the operating theater. You can imagine it'd be very stressful. But he was one of the only people who could do it because he had developed this antiseptic system. He knew that the risk with a mastectomy, that the risk of infection was quite high, and he agreed to do it. And it took a lot out of him. But he's successful with the operation, but she does die of cancer several years later. But it is an extraordinary part of the story.
Yeah, and his father survived after his mother died, did he move back down south to be with his father? Was that what took him back down to London?
He was very close to his father, and I think certainly there was that he always wanted to get back to London, and I think that there was that family connection certainly, but I think that there was a bit of ego involved. You know, London was the last holdout for Lister. They really pushed back against his theories and his antiseptic system. He had been going all over the world. He had gone to America to convince surgeons of the need to adopt antisepsis, and he had gotten some surgeons, like Samuel Gross, for instance, who is portrayed on the cover of my US book. He was a surgeon in the US, and he so didn't believe in Lister, he would walk into the operating theater, he would slam the door, and he would say, "There, Mr. Lister's germs can't get in anymore." So he really didn't like Lister. And Lister is able to convert him at the end of this tour. And it's incredible and really a testament to his teaching skills. But London was a holdout. And I think that, you know, part of his ego, whatever was kind of there, because he wasn't very egotistical, but I think part of him, he wanted to convince London, the London medical scene, that this was the way forward. And of course, it would bring him back, you know, closer to his father. And so that is ultimately the goal, is that he returns to London at the end.
Yeah. So Joseph Lister, we're going to hear about him all week, but what we're really also wanting to hear about is this new book that you're writing, Lindsey, about Harold Gillies. So tell us a bit about that.
Oh, the new book. I've been working on this book for 3.5 years. It's funny because when you guys approached me about Lister, I had to brush up with it because, you know, when a book is written, I started writing The Butchering Art in 2015. And then what happens is the book gets finished and then it spends a year in production. So by the time you start tour, you know, you haven't actually been working on the book as such for quite a bit of time. So a lot of time has passed between, you know, writing The Butchering Art. And I've been spending a lot of time with another person. So my next book is about this guy named Harold Gillies, who is known by some as the father of modern plastic surgery. Although I concede that there are a lot of contenders for that title, he is one of those contenders. And he was a brilliant surgeon who was rebuilding soldiers' faces during the First World War. And I say that, you know, this was a time in the First World War when losing your limb made you a hero, but losing your face had devastating consequences for these men. And, you know, even today, that kind of disfigurement carries with it a social stigma. So he was able to give these men back their identity, and nobody had really been doing it to the extent that he was doing it. And this is before antibiotics. He has no real manual. He's figuring this out. So it's an incredible war tale. It features a dentist who retrofits his Rolls Royce with a dental chair and drives it to the front under a hail of bullets. So there's a bunch of characters in it. And I hope, like the Lister story, people can connect with it and also fall in love with Gillies as I have done over the last 3 years.
I'm sure we will. And what I think we would all love is to see the Lister story in a movie of The Butchering Art. So that'll be fun to work on that. What stage are you at with it?
From your lips to God's ears.
What stage is it at?
Well, I finished the script, you know. I know. It's one of those things, you know, I filmed the book trailer, which I think you've shown, or you're going to be showing for Lister Week. My friends are filmmakers, and we've had an incredible time piecing his story together in a cinematic way. But there's different roadblocks I come across. So I realized I was going to have to write that script. And the different kinds of challenges you have when writing a script, for instance, we can't really age Lister that much throughout the movie because of the constraints with budgets and actors. So if the movie comes out, it's going to look like his triumph kind of happens in a more condensed time frame than it actually does historically. But I did say, there was a little bit of in discussions, you know, getting him to various locations. I said, he's got to get to Glasgow. That's one of the things that has to happen. He's got to get to Glasgow. It's too important in Lister's story. But I hope I can make that come to life for people, because I think he's an extraordinary person and definitely worthy of more people knowing his story in the general public.
Yeah, well, we would love it to come to Glasgow as well. It'd be a real treat.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Lindsey, I know that you're a really, really busy schedule today. So we just want to say thank you so much for helping us with Lister Week, because I think you're definitely the star of the show this week, and I'm sure it will get lots of attention and boost our ratings.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's like I said, it's been a joy to even find out that there was a Lister Week. And it's just been really fun to kind of interact with you guys. I can't wait to do the Twitter takeover, although, we're recording this.
Yes.
So maybe this comes after. Sorry, guys.
No, thanks for taking over Twitter yesterday.
Twitter takeover. Yeah, hopefully everybody enjoyed that Twitter takeover. But you know, it's a great tale, and it's wonderful to see doctors in the medical community recognizing Lister's legacy as well. So it's been a real joy.
Lovely. Well, listen, I hope we can meet in person in the future. And thanks again, Lindsey, and have a lovely day.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Stay safe.
Thanks. You too.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.